The Tu-160 is often called the Soviet answer to the B-1B Lancer. That comparison is technically correct, but honestly, it kind of misses the point entirely. The lesser-known fact is that the Tu-160 is significantly larger, faster, and heavier than the American bomber it supposedly copied. At 279 tons maximum takeoff weight, the White Swan outweighs the B-1B by nearly 60 tons. The misconception is that the Soviet Union built the Tu-160 to look impressive in parades. In reality, it was a desperate response to a specific strategic problem. The Soviet Navy needed a bomber that could outrun NATO interceptors while carrying long-range cruise missiles. The overlooked consequence is that the Tu-160 bankrupted the Soviet bomber production system. Only 35 were ever completed. The White Swan is a masterpiece of engineering and, honestly, a monument to unsustainable ambition. So, back in 1967, the Soviet Air Force issued a requirement for a new strategic bomber. The existing Tu-95 Bear was, well, just too slow. And the supersonic Tu-22 Blinder, it had limited range. The new bomber, they said, needed to reach Mach 2 at altitude and carry cruise missiles capable of striking the continental United States. The design competition, interestingly enough, came down to just two teams, Tupolev and Myasishchev. Myasishchev put forward a sleek, delta-wing design they called the M18. Tupolev, on the other hand, proposed a variable sweep wing design, which was actually derived from the Tu-22M backfire. In the end, the government selected Tupolev, partly, because Myasishchev had already been disbanded once before. But here's an overlooked human detail. Tupolev's team actually hated variable sweep wings. They thought they were heavy, complicated, and just really prone to mechanical failure. The pivot mechanism for those wings alone weighed 8 tons for each wing. And get this, each pivot had to withstand 24 tons of force during flight maneuvers. Tupolev engineers calculated that the wing mechanism would require 500 hours of maintenance for every single flight hour. An absurd ratio that honestly never materialized, mostly because the bomber just wasn't built in large numbers. The first Tu-160 prototype rolled out in 1981. Western intelligence saw satellite photos and, well, assumed it was a modified B-1B, which had first flown 7 years earlier. The Soviets encouraged this mistake by releasing similar performance figures. In truth, the Tu-160 was 20% heavier and had 30% more fuel capacity than the B-1B. The White Swan's engines, 4 Kuznetsov NK-32 afterburning turbofans, produced 55,000 pounds of thrust each. That is, honestly, the most powerful engine ever fitted to a combat aircraft. The NK-32 was so advanced that after the Soviet collapse, Russia classified the technical documentation for over 2 decades. China reportedly tried to buy the engine design multiple times. Russia refused. The Tu-160 entered service in 1987, just 4 years before the Soviet Union dissolved. At its peak, the Soviet Air Force planned to buy 100 White Swans. They built 35. The reason was not just cost, although each bomber cost roughly $300 million in 1990 dollars. It was also the collapse of the supply chain. The NK-32 engines came from a factory in Kuibyshev that also produced rocket engines. The titanium wing pivots came from a plant in Ukraine that went bankrupt in 1992. The human limit of the Tu-160 was never really the airframe itself. It was actually the pilot. Flying a variable sweep bomber at Mach 2 requires this constant, almost exhausting attention to wing position, airspeed, and fuel balance. If the wings are fully swept back at low speed, well, the bomber just falls out of the sky. But if the wings are fully extended at high speed, the airframe pretty much tears itself apart. Tu-160 pilots train for years on these specialized simulators before they ever touch the real aircraft. And even then, the first flight is often described as, quote, wrestling a bear that also wants to be a cheetah. There's this wry observation that the White Swan's NATO reporting name was Blackjack. You know, like the card game, not the club. But, interestingly, many pilots called it the Duchess because of the incredibly smooth ride at supersonic speeds. At subsonic speeds, though, it handled more like a loaded truck. So, after the Soviet collapse, most Tu-160s were actually based in Ukraine. Ukraine inherited 19 bombers, which for a while was more than Russia itself had. For several years, Ukraine offered to dismantle them under these US-funded cooperative threat reduction programs. Russia honestly panicked. In 1999, Russia bought back 8 bombers from Ukraine by forgiving a $285 million gas debt. The remaining 11 were scrapped under US supervision, their engines crushed while a Ukrainian worker looked on, a moment that, to this day, still irritates Russian military historians. The Tu-160 saw combat for the first time in 2015 over Syria. It launched Kh-555 cruise missiles from the Caspian Sea, flying 4,500 kilometers to strike targets. Not a single Tu-160 was lost. The Syrian missions also revealed a surprising limitation. The White Swan's navigation system required manual input for waypoints outside Russian territory. Pilots carried printed maps as backup. In 2020, Russia announced plans to restart Tu-160 production. The new version, called the Tu-160M, features modern avionics, a glass cockpit, and a digital fly-by-wire system. But, you know, the airframe is identical to the 1987 design. The engineers who originally built it are mostly retired, or, well, gone. Restarting production required reverse engineering some components because the original blueprints had actually been lost or even sold for scrap. That is honestly an astonishing fact. One of the largest combat aircraft ever built is still in production, and the factory had to figure out how to build it a second time, pretty much from memory. The current Russian Air Force has about 16 operational Tu-160s. That is not a large force, but each White Swan can carry 12 cruise missiles, and each missile can carry a nuclear warhead. Quantity, in this case, is not the point. The point is presence. The Tu-160 White Swan is, well, a paradox. It is the largest and heaviest combat bomber ever built. Heavier than the B-52, faster than the B-1B, more powerful than the B-2. And it is almost useless in any war except the one that, honestly, never happened. The broader lesson here is about the difference between strategic capability and practical utility. The Soviet Union built the White Swan to signal that it could match American technology. But by the time the bomber was ready, the country that built it was gone. The Tu-160 survived because Russia inherited it and decided that national pride was, worth the maintenance cost. Every time a White Swan flies a patrol mission over the Norwegian Sea, NATO interceptors scramble to follow it. The bomber never drops a bomb. But it wins simply by taking off. That is the logic of strategic aviation. Sometimes the weapon is the mission, and the White Swan, for all its Cold War baggage, is very good at that one specific job. It makes people pay attention. Subscribe to War Machiner and share this if you value history that goes deeper.